Hey guys, welcome to Grad Coach TV, where we demystify and simplify the oftentimes confusing world of academic research. My name's David, and today I'm chatting to one of our trusted coaches, Peter Quella, about how to find high quality sources for your literature review. Specifically, we're going to be discussing 6 practical tips you can use during this important stage of the literature review process. This discussion is based on one of the many articles over on the Grad Coach blog. So, if you'd like to learn more about the literature review process, you can check out the blog at gradcoach.com/blog. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your literature review, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where we hold your hand throughout the entire process. You can find out more information and book a free consultation with one of our friendly coaches at gradcoach.com. Hey Peter, welcome to the Coachcast. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here, David. Thank you very much.
Great. So we're going to just dive right into it. And our first tip is to have a clear search strategy. So Peter, what can we do to have a plan of action for our literature search?
You want to start with what we call your golden thread, your research aims, your research objective, and your research question. Between those 3 things, we know where we're going, we know what we want to produce, and we know the general layout of what we need to understand for the research. Once you have that, then we can identify some keywords. Keywords are what it sounds like, the main elements of your research question, concepts, variables. We have a number of different ways of identifying what these things are, but generally they are the elements that we're going to use in developing the search. The next piece of advice is that you can't just depend on the words that you have within your research question or aim or objectives. You want to develop some synonyms. I was just working with a client who wanted to research alignment in his business. We discovered through some basic searches in the library that there was another term, another thread within the literature on congruence. And it was just 2 different sets of researchers, the same concept. So those are the sorts of things that you want to be considering as you're developing your search terms. The other thing you might want to consider is that English is spelled differently in the UK and the US. And so take spelling into consideration. Mm-hmm. If you use an English spelling, more than likely the search term or the results of a search are going to show you what's coming out of English publications. Mm. Same with the US. Now, there's lots of overlap, but just keep this in mind as you're developing your search term. The best way, as I suggested already, to develop your search strategy is to consider how other researchers have labeled or used key terms for their research. So maybe something has come up in that search for alignment, but you see that they have 3 or 4 other key terms listed on their article. Note those. Those will help you develop your search. The next big step in this process is to identify the databases that you're going to do your search in. There are lots of different databases. You might not notice them necessarily or be aware of them within your library search engine, but if you dig down a little bit, there are many potential databases. Google Scholar is probably the best place to start. It's the easiest place to start. It has a great algorithm if you know what your search terms are, but there are lots of limitations with Google Scholar in terms of narrowing what you're actually getting in your results. Mm-hmm. Library databases are better in that way. You can very often eliminate search by very specific years. You can search by journal titles. You can search by a variety of things like that help you limit what the results are that you're getting. These databases have many names, and they are very subject specific. So If you're, let's say, you're looking for medical research, Medline or PubMed, those are two of the bigger titles, both US based. So that's something to keep in mind if you're specifically looking for UK research. ProQuest is one of the big databases. It has numerous databases within its search engine. One of my favorites is JSTOR. If you're working with history, really important to know that, and to recognize that these databases are constantly being updated, and they're very specific though in terms of what the journals they're going to include within their searches. The important thing to recognize as well, in terms of finding the right database to be searching in, is that you have help. Either a grad coach, your supervisor, or best, a librarian. These folks who are comfortable with the topic will know where the best journals are indexed, and they can help you find the right database to be searching in.
I think that's a great point, Peter, especially because that's a librarian's job, or one of them at least. So they really are the specialists in this area. So definitely reach out to them. I've known many librarians who've helped me through searches before as well. One of the other things to keep in mind when you're doing a search strategy is your literature search terms that you use, those keywords that you've identified before, can be put together in most search algorithms with Boolean operators. Now, Boolean operators are symbols and characters that you use to refine your search. And some good, easy examples are and, or not. And allows you to have two terms that both need to be present in the search string, or gives you the option of one or the other. And really helpfully, not is one that would keep certain fields out. So if you find in your research there is a related field that is tangential to yours, but is not something you're interested in, you can use keywords and the not Boolean operator to really remove those from your study, so that you're not finding all of that literature that you're going to be disregarding anyway. The other one to keep in mind, and this does depend on search algorithms, is you can also use wildcards. So for instance, often enough, that's a star, and that allows you to look for the latter half of a word. So for instance, if we're looking at identification as a concept, you can go with ident star, and that will then give you identity, identification, and all the other words related to that. And so these are really cool extra additions in your search algorithm that you can use to really improve your results. And as I said, when it comes to Google Scholar, you're definitely going to need to start narrowing down, and Boolean operators is one way to get that. So our second tip is to understand the different types of literature that's available to you and how you can use them to your advantage. So Peter, what can we do here, and what are the types of literature that we have access to?
Yeah, generally there are two main types of literature that you're going to be dealing with: primary and secondary. Primary research is what you might consider the main sources that you're going to be using in your literature review. There's surveys, interviews, fieldwork, experiments, research papers that were published in academic journals. This is what we mean by primary research. They are excellent for referencing, for representing the conversations on core concepts for your research, maybe definitions. They can be excellent models for you to look at and say, this is the kind of work that I'm trying to produce. And they can be excellent for empirical information. So the research that they did, the interviews that they did, this sort of thing representing the empirical side of it, the who their sample was, that sort of information is really excellent to reference in your research. The other type is secondary research. These are things like reviews, textbooks, commentaries in industry magazines. And they are good for getting the overview of the current state of knowledge, how studies fit together. So you would be using this in chapter 1. You could use some of it in chapter 2, but it tends to be something where you're working with this to contextualize the problem that you are explaining or describing. It's really helpful for organizing your knowledge, seeing the links between the sort of the rationale for how to present the information. Those are the two main types of research available and that you will be using in your presentation.
I think that's a great point, and you've done really well to cover both primary and secondary research. Just something to add on is there is also tertiary or gray literature. And this is really not necessarily peer-reviewed articles or information. So often enough examples would be industry papers, theses, dissertations, or even website articles or blog posts. And it's important to remember these aren't peer-reviewed, and so they don't represent the sort of highest level of academic rigor, but they're really, really useful for giving you up-to-date data on what is happening right now in your field. So for instance, in the business environment, often enough, many of the big consulting companies will have industry papers on specific topics that you can find out the latest information and some facts and figures about what's happening. It's also really great for contextualizing your problem as well. Often enough, you can use these kind of sources to really base your research in, and then from that support it with primary and secondary research. So again, gray literature is great, but it's something to use sparingly as it isn't peer reviewed. So our third tip is to evaluate the quality of the sources you're identifying and using. So Peter, this is quite a complex thing to do. Do you have any advice on how to evaluate the quality of sources?
Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum of source quality available, and it kind of comes through in how we were talking about it before: primary, secondary, tertiary. The peer-reviewed journal articles are going to be the gold standard for referencing in your research report. That's really where you want to focus your energies on finding information to be using. Then we might consider the secondary sources like industry publications. Lastly, maybe blog journals, those that tertiary level. They may have up-to-date information, but they may not also be accurate, and they haven't been judged as being accurate. So it's one of these things where you just want to recognize this spectrum. There are some ways that we consider measuring the value of certain journals as well. So impact factors. It's not always based on the size, maybe the distribution of the journal. Very often it could be on reputation amongst scholars. These are the sorts of things that you'd want to consider if you asked, again, your librarian or your supervisor what the impact factor of a journal is. These things are also available online. If you search what are the top 5 or 10 journals in my field, very often you'll find those sorts of lists available. What you want to be aware of are predatory journals. And this, with the internet, has become very common. Predatory journals are those journals that are publishing without peer review, without any kind of check on the quality of the research. There is something called Beall's List available online, and you can always check, I found this great article, seems to fit my topic. Take that journal title, look at Beall's List, and make sure that it's not there, that it's not listed as being something where scholars are paying for their publications to be available online. If you're finding things through your library database, that might be the best way of understanding that this is a quality journal. Most of the databases only include quality journals. But if you're using something a little bit broader like Google Scholar or perhaps just Google itself, this is where you might run into problems.
I think that's an excellent point that you've brought up, and it's really something to be aware of. Just modern era internet, people are taking advantage where they can. One of the other ways that we can also assess a source of literature, and also can help with the predatory journals as well, is to consider how many citations a paper has. So it's really important to consider how well that source is cited given its age. And that's obviously important to keep in mind. A 10-year-old study should have more citations than a 1-year-old study, assuming they're of equal quality. It's also worthwhile contextualizing that citation rate. Research in cancer, for instance, is going to have much higher citation rates than, for instance, the thematic analysis of comic book characters. As you can tell, there's probably more papers, more citations happening in cancer research. And so we want to keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the age of the source. You need to consider, is that source applicable and reasonable to be using in your research? And so a good rule of thumb is to focus on recent literature, because that's what we're interested in developing. So I would say often enough, 3 to 5 years should be the majority of your research. It's all right to have older papers if they are landmark papers or are introducing a framework or a model that has been worked on since. So you definitely want to keep those original sources, but then look at the more recent literature to find more recent support. And so once you consider the impact factor of a journal, the citation rates, and the age of the source, you should have a pretty good idea of the quality of the source that you are working with. So our fourth tip is to use a reference manager and a literature catalog. Now, these are software or programs we can use that really help us in the process. Peter, what's the benefit of a reference manager, and why are so many scientists using it nowadays?
Well, let me start by saying what reference managers are, or some of the names of them. There's Mendeley, there's Zotero, there's EndNote, RefWorks, and that's just a few. These are really useful tools. What are they useful for? They're useful for ensuring that when you are citing something in your paper or adding a citation to your bibliography, that they are correctly formatted in the format for your discipline. There are many options available. APA, Harvard, Chicago, MLA, all of these are different styles of representing the citation. And each field feels it's a very academic activity to use the proper way of citing something in your paper so that others know how to find that citation or that work that you're citing. Having said that, for any one of these, you want to double check and make sure that what you're importing, because a lot of the library databases or Google Scholar will provide a downloaded file that you can import into your reference manager that helps just populate what the citation, the information required in the citation is. Unfortunately, sometimes that information is incorrect, or it can be imported improperly. So you just want to double check and make sure that all of that is proper. How do you do that? Just go back to the original citation from the library database and check. Did that get downloaded properly? I will say it's a relatively rare incident. Depends on your field and the quality of the journal sometimes. Those sorts of things will come into play as to why a downloaded reference might be incorrect. The other great thing about a reference manager is you can actually load the PDF file into it. And that helps you stay organized. It helps ensure that you have access to that paper. It's an easy way to always find that same paper again once you've downloaded it. Last point that I'd want to make is that Grad Coach has videos on using Zotero and Mendeley. You could also watch those. They can be very, very helpful explaining how to actually use them as a tool in your research.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. I definitely agree with what you've said. The amount of times that in my master's and PhD that I lost papers because I wasn't taking advantage of these tools. And then you have to go find it again, search for it in the correct way. So this is really useful software to aid you in your research journey. The other one we mentioned was a literature catalog. This is quite different to a reference manager, and it's something you often create yourself. We do have a free resource that's an example catalog that you could use to start with, but it's important to make a research catalog your own. So what does a research catalog do? Well, it's a place where you can make notes and information and really understand the source that you're working with. Generally speaking, I use an Excel document, and for each paper that I read, I create a new entry in my literature catalog that says what's in the paper, what is it about, what type of research is it, and you can go through all of those questions you often enough need to keep in mind for yourself. And so it's a great way of taking notes that you can come back to. The great thing about Excel, if you're working in that, you can filter or search in that document. And it's a really helpful way to go back to research you read maybe 3 months ago to make sure that you have an idea about what you were covering. Again, the important thing here is that you've got to make it your own. Each catalog, everyone's going to have a slightly different one because we have slightly different focus points for our research. But as long as you're consistent in using it, it can be an excellent source to go back to when you're actually now writing up your research.
You know, David, I'd like to add that it's never too late to use these tools. Even if you've started your research already and have a lot of files, they are easily imported into a reference manager. They're easily revisited through a literature catalog. And those activities will help you understand the work that you have.
Definitely. I also can say for myself, I didn't have a literature catalog when I did my PhD, and I regret it massively because I had to go back and reread so many papers, even though it wasn't necessary. So having a good catalog, having a good reference manager can really speed up your writing process in particular. So our fifth tip is to read broadly and comprehensively. And this is really important, particularly at the initial stages of your research. So Peter, how can we ensure that we're doing this efficiently and successfully?
Yeah, there's usually, my advice is to read widely as possible so that you can consider multiple perspectives. The idea here is generally in literature, in what we call the literature, there might be multiple threads on the same topic, different researchers taking different approaches to the same topic. And you don't have to represent all of them in your literature review, but the key ones are extremely important. You don't want to develop some sense of tunnel vision or have blind spots in how you're writing about your topic. And so reading widely and recognizing that there are distinctions in how researchers have approached the topic is really important. You also want to consider other perspectives on the topic. And you do that by reading widely. A great literature review will always include a couple of disagreements about the main thrust of what you're arguing or what you're representing. There might be alternate explanations or different frameworks for how your topic has been approached. And there might be related contexts. This is something that in certain types of literature or certain types of literature reviews or research where it's more exploratory, you want to consider these related contexts. So sometimes you might run into a case where there's not a lot of literature on your specific topic. That doesn't mean that you can't research that topic. The strategy that we tend to suggest at that point is to look at adjacent literatures, or what I call parallel literatures. Maybe this is a case where you have research done in a country that's not the country that you're looking at. This is perfectly fine to then review that literature and recognize this research was done elsewhere. It's not done in the country that I'm looking at, but it can be helpful for understanding perhaps some of the concepts, some of the relationships. It's that sort of information that you want to be looking for as a way of developing your topic in your literature review.
I think that's a great point. One of the other things you can keep in mind is when you're reading other papers is you can snowball from their references. So really, once you find a core set of literature, take a look at their reference list and read through all of the sources that they've identified. Often enough, that's a great way to identify potential literature that you might have missed in your search, or to identify that parallel or related literature Peter was talking about. But the problem with just looking at the reference list is it is only going to go backwards. So research that had been published prior to the source you're looking at. If you want to go forwards and see how the field or the topic has developed since a paper, it's really useful to go take a look at the paper on something like Google Scholar and to look at who has since cited the work. We live in the modern era where everything is now indexed, and because of that, we can actually track how many times a paper's been cited and by who, and we can use that to really keep up to date on a topic. This is particularly important when you get to review papers that were done maybe 3 or 5 years ago. They're really great sources, but you want to see if they've been updated since then. And so snowballing from citations is really useful. But the one thing to keep in mind when you're snowballing is do be careful that you don't get stuck in a channel. For instance, many researchers often cite their own work or cite the work of their collaborators. And that means if you're only snowballing from one research group, you're going to get stuck in that one research group's perspective. And so that's why, as Peter said, it's really important to also consider alternate explanations or frameworks to understand your topic.
Yeah, you all great points. Although I suspect some people might be saying, "Oh, I'm overwhelmed now. I'm going forward, backward, considering all of these disagreements or alternate explanations." It can easily feel as if you're overwhelmed with literature. But this leads us to the last point that we want to make here, which is you don't have to read the full article to begin with. You need to strategically skim the articles. This is a tactic that will save you a great deal of time and actually help you really come to grips with the key elements of any of the research that you're reading. By skimming, I mean start with the title. Does the title fit your topic? If it does, look at the abstract. The abstract is going to provide a much richer explanation of everything that piece of research has done, from what question it asked to what its findings were, to what its recommendations are, to the methodology. Really helpful to understand those basic elements of any piece of research. Finally, you might also want, if in both of those cases, the title and the abstract sound good to you, the next thing to look at might be the findings and the limitations. Those two will help you better understand what the sample was, what they thought about their research project as far as the success of it. And that can be helpful for understanding how you might then strategically use it in your literature review.
I think those are great points, Peter, especially because often enough at a literature search level, we can find so many papers that it can be really, really daunting. So definitely identifying a way to skim through those sources and decide which ones are worth really reading in detail is great. So our sixth And final tip is to keep your golden thread front of mind throughout the research process. Peter, why is the golden thread so important, and why do we need to come back to it so often?
Yeah, you really want to make sure that the identified literature that you're finding fits or aligns with your golden thread and that it's going to be applicable to your study. You want to understand how it can be valuable related to your golden thread. How do you do that? You have to ask yourself about its relevancy. You have to understand how closely related it is to the key topics that you are interested in presenting in your literature review. That's your litmus test to determine whether or not it's going to be a useful resource. Otherwise, you can really go down a rabbit hole and you can get off topic very easily. Always try to relate it back to your golden thread and understand strategically how it's useful for you. In so doing, this is going to make putting your literature review together much quicker. So keeping that golden thread in mind and making decisions based on that golden thread, at least at this early stage, is the quickest way to get your literature review organized and the literature that you're using into an order that is going to be helpful. If you decide that a piece isn't going to be significant for you, set it aside. You can always come back. You may determine later on as you read through more literature that that particular piece could be useful in a way, but it's not helpful to get bogged down with trying to determine the best way something can be used if it's not apparent from your quick review of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Peter. That golden thread, keeping it in mind, really helps to develop a cohesive piece of research, and it really helps you avoid just wasting time. However, it's worth noting your golden thread isn't always going to stay the same. For instance, as you're reading the literature, you might have to update your aims. Maybe you thought there was a gap and have since identified that there is research on it, but you've identified new gaps. So do realize that your golden thread can change and develop as you research, but whatever you do, make sure that you keep in mind what it currently is, and then also go back and make sure it's consistently there in previous chapters as well. I often find this happens. We have a golden thread in mind for our introduction and our lit review. Once we then run the experiment or collect the data, then we start seeing new ideas come out in the research that we'd love to really dig into. If that's the case and you update that key message, your aims and objectives, you need to then go back and make sure that that's covered in the preceding chapters as well. We always say in all sorts of writing, don't surprise your audience with something new unless it's really from your data.
Great point. Yeah. The important thing to remember with your research, until it's submitted, things can change. It's always a document that's being developed and a process that's in development.
Great points, Peter. Thank you so much for coming into the Coachcast today. I hope it's been helpful for everyone to pick your brain on how to optimize their search strategies.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you again.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up this episode of Grad Coach TV. Remember, for more information on the literature review process, be sure to check out the Grad Coach blog at gradcoach.com/blog. There you can also get access to our free dissertation and thesis writing mini course, which covers all the information you need to get started on your research journey. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your dissertation or thesis, check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where you can work with one of our friendly coaches, just like Peter. For more information and to book a free consultation, head over to gradcoach.com. So, that's all for today. Until next time, good luck.